for being with us here in Indianapolis tonight. It is truly an honor to have you here with our community. And I hope you got to see some of the incredible leaders who will be going through the training tomorrow and also on Sunday, and really just diving into their own civic and political journeys. So thank you again. And is there anything else that you would like to mention? I know you have an extensive resume, but if there's anything else that you'd like to let us know about your history and your journey that brought you to this point, we would love to know.
Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. I want to start by thanking all of you for being here and thanking Iman for inviting me. It's such an honor to be a part of this program in some small way. I think this is the kind of program that every single state, every single city, every single region needs. So you really are trailblazers and leading the way. I'd like to add something to my bio because it's such a passion project of mine. It's almost like a side note, but I host a podcast called Quran Conversations. And it's something that's very dear to my heart. So if you're interested, check it out. But what brought me here today, if that's the question, that's such a broad question, is a very windy road that I absolutely did not expect. Because I was the child of two Egyptian engineers. And so obviously I also became an engineer. You know, that it doesn't, I'm Egyptian, so therefore I'm an engineer. So I graduated from high school and went into the College of Engineering at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And at the same time, I was going through, classes on heat transfer and things like, material density and so forth, and all the things that chemical engineers study. I was also organizing protests to protest violence against Palestinians. I was writing articles against Islamophobia. I was the president of the Bosnia Relief Committee. At the time, we had the genocide in Bosnia. So I was incredibly passionate about these kinds of causes, and all of my activism, the only person literally in the entire College of Engineering who did this kind of, at least as an undergrad, did this kind of activism was me. I was very passionate about that kind of work. So I was an engineer by day and an activist by night, basically. And so when I graduated from college, it was time for the real world, and I got a job at a great company called Procter & Gamble, not very far away from here. And I moved to Cincinnati, Ohio, actually. So I got married and I had my first son, and I was living the Egyptian-American dream. Great corporate job, a baby, everything was going as planned. And I had kind of forgotten or set aside my activist past. And then it was time for us to move to Pittsburgh to start graduate school. And we got ourselves ready and had the car all packed. And as we were watching the news that morning, to our shock and horror, two planes crashed into the Twin Towers. It was September 11th, 2001. So we were in complete shock. We didn't know what was going to happen next, and we decided to postpone our move until the next day, and then we drove across middle America from Cincinnati to Pittsburgh on the day after 9/11. And I was dressed just like I am now. And we drove and drove and drove until there was no more gas in the car. We had to stop, and it was in the middle of nowhere, gas station, with a baby in the car, and me dressed like this, and we were really scared. We were actually scared for our safety. And I remember for the first time in my life, I was afraid for someone to know I was a Muslim. And so I sunk really low down in the car as my husband put gas in the car, and I was just praying that we would be okay. And we arrived in Pittsburgh on that day. It was Wednesday of that first week. It was a new city, it was a new job, it was a new education, a new university. Everything was new, and it felt like a new country that we were waking up to. And we simply didn't know what to expect. And so that Friday, normally we go to Joma, and it was our first Friday in this new city. And we weren't sure if we should go. There were sort of warnings that had been passed around that it was dangerous to stay home that first Friday, that you just don't know what is going to happen. Our community might be a target. And so we had initially decided not to go. We thought, it's just better to be safe. But what we ended up thinking is like, we can't allow this horrific act to dictate to us how we were going to show up in our own country as Muslims. And we needed to put our faith before our fear. So we drove to the mosque that day. It was the Islamic Center of Pittsburgh, or the Arabic name was Dar es-Salam, the House of Peace. And to our surprise, not only were we there, but the entire parking lot was completely full and even overflowing. And as I took off my shoes and holding my infant at the time, walking in, what I saw just made me stop in my tracks, because a full half of our congregation that day were people of other faiths, who were there not to be angry, not to attack us, but to show us solidarity. And it was such a moving experience, such an incredibly transformative experience for me to see that. And it was actually at that moment, that day, that first Friday, that I rededicated my life to building bridges, not bunkers. That we were not going to be isolated because of this event, that we were not going to break off from the world, that this was a call for us to reach out even more proactively. And so as I was doing business school in Pittsburgh, I also became the outreach director at the Islamic Center of Pittsburgh. I was the only one that applied for the job. So not hard to get that kind of volunteer job that works you 60 hours a week. For some reason, I was the only one who applied. Who knew? And that's what I did when I was in business school. And it was really interesting. When we talk about intention, we talk about niyyah. All of you are here because you have an intention. When I was applying for business school before all of this, my intention was I wanted to do, a certain kind of work. I thought it would be good for my career and so forth. And after that experience in the masjid that day, my intention to go to business school was for a completely different reason, which is to learn how to better communicate about Islam in a way that would reach people's minds and hearts more effectively. And it wasn't so that we could sugarcoat or spin, but we could be understood accurately. And so that's what I did. That's what I went to school to do. And I then, after finishing business school, I got a job at a company called Gallup. Now, if you have never heard of Gallup, they are famous for something called the Gallup poll. They do surveys in America and around the world. But at that time, the job I got was as a consultant. So the majority of their revenue stream comes from, polls don't make money, they cost money. So they have to make money somehow, and so what they do, which is their main work is they do management consulting, and that's what I was doing there. And so that was my entry point. And one day, our CEO announced, I was about a year in, doing my job, as a good now business consultant. Nothing to do with Islam, Muslims, or anything. I was doing coaching of executives, and he announced that we were going to do something called the World Poll. And he said, we're going to hear the voice of the world. We're going to survey the entire world. Countries that have never been surveyed before are going to be heard. And we're starting with majority Muslim countries. And he was inspired to do this because the story goes that Rumsfeld, at a news conference after 9/11, somebody asked him, well, what do Muslims think about what just happened? And he's like, I don't know, it's not like we can do a Gallup poll. So our CEO said, yes, we will. We will do a Gallup poll, and that's in fact what he did do. And I raised my hand and I said, hey, can I work on this? And he said, sure, in your evenings and weekends, because you still have a job as a management consultant. And that's exactly what I did. I worked on this project in my spare time. And I analyzed reams of data, and I created PowerPoints, all, after my normal work day was over. And that's a lesson I actually want to share, is if you want a job that you don't have right now, do the work for that job, and eventually you might get the opportunity to do it. And that's exactly what happened. It was divine intervention, in my opinion. So I was doing management consulting with a client, and I mentioned that I was really excited about this project and how the data was coming back, and it was mind-blowing, and everyone needs to hear this, and everyone needs to understand what Muslims really think, because it's so misunderstood, and now we finally have data, we finally have evidence. And he said, well, send me this PowerPoint. So I did, I sent it to him, and it made its way to a very big philanthropist who doesn't want to be named. And he saw the PowerPoint, and he decided that he wanted to fund a big project to get this information to the world. And that's how it happened, and that's how I got to do this work, and that's how I started from a chemical engineer to what I'm doing now. Long story, but that's it.
What an incredible journey. Yeah, that's amazing that you have gone through so much and witnessed so much, and now you're able to share your experiences with everyone, and especially here as well. So I just have a couple of questions related to our own personal responsibility that we feel as a community to get involved and to kind of follow in your footsteps, no matter what background we come from, no matter what specific workforce that we're in, our background in workforce. How can each and every one of us take that next step and really move it forward? So I don't think that anybody here would disagree that you've put yourself in some pretty uncomfortable spaces, but in spaces where people might not understand you or might not understand your faith. What drives you to continue to speak with politicians and with advocates all over the world, and really just push this narrative forward?
Thank you so much for that question. Uncomfortable spaces, yes. 100%. I'm often, at the time, the only woman in the room, the only hijab-wearing woman for sure. Sometimes the only person of color, definitely the only Muslim, and that would be a normal day in my job when I started working as the executive director of the Gallup Center for Muslim Studies. My job, because of this project, was to educate leaders on the results of the Gallup surveys about Muslims, to tell the world what Muslims really think. And what drove me is that I had landed this opportunity I had been given undeservingly. this trust that other people didn't have access to. They weren't in those rooms, they weren't at those tables. And I realized that this was a responsibility and a trust. And I had to steward that trust in a way that is befitting my faith and the prophet that I claim to follow. And I'm always reminded of this story. So I am someone who's fascinated by the Seerah. I'm a student of the Seerah, I'm a student of the Quran. And it's a lifelong journey. One of the stories that I can barely tell without choking up is actually the one where Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam left Sayyidina Ali in his place to sleep and when he was migrating. And we all know the story of how a member of each tribe wanted to assassinate Rasulullah, and they thought if they dispersed the crime across all the tribes, no one could be punished. You can't fight all the tribes. And so Ali radiallahu anhu was sleeping in his place. Now, stay with me here. Why was one of the main reasons that Sayyidina Ali was left back when Rasulullah ﷺ had to leave Mecca for his own life, because he was going to be killed otherwise? Sayyidina Ali was left behind to return the amana, the trusts that had been bestowed with the Prophet, had been given to the Prophet, peace be upon him, by the very people who were conspiring to assassinate him. But he had to return their trust back to them, because he was trustworthy, because he was a good steward of a trust. So if that is our example, and we're given a trust of being in a room that other people don't have access to, or we're given an opportunity to voice the needs of people who don't have access to those halls of power, how could we allow something like some discomfort, some Islamophobic statements, some glares, some stares deter us? The mission is so much higher, and the stakes are so much higher than our own comfort. We have to, it's not that we aren't scared, it's that some things are more important than our fear. And that's really what it's about. It's about realizing the trust that has been bestowed with you and taking that seriously. If you have that role as a leader, all of you that have been entered into this or have started this journey with this wonderful program, understand the importance of that responsibility, and that you're always in those rooms representing the marginalized, representing the underserved, representing people who don't have the same access that you've been given, and that you carry out that responsibility in a way that would make our Prophet proud.
Thank you. Those are some incredibly wise words, and you touched on it a little bit there a moment ago, that some people are afraid right now. So I know that many of us have heard this feedback, and I'm sure you have as well, but people are feeling afraid to advocate for themselves right now on behalf of their identity, their faith, for their community. And we've seen that people have lost their jobs, their visas, etc., for speaking out for Palestine. So what do you say to those who are afraid right now, and what piece of encouragement do you have for them going forward?
Well, the first thing I would say to people who are afraid is, I hear you and I understand, because the consequences are real. It's not in your head. People are deported. People are losing jobs, having their scholarships taken away. It's real, and the consequences are sometimes dire. So I cannot give you, I cannot decide for you what you are going to do or not do, but my advice to you is to remember that your only responsibility is not to make the change that you want to see in the world. That's up to God. We have no power. لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله. There is no change and there is no power except with God. We are responsible for what we do and what we intend. And the other piece of advice I want to keep you thinking about is the other side of that is لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها. Allah does not hold you accountable for more than you can bear. So take the weight off your shoulders of thinking it's up to you to make change. It is not up to you to make change, but it is up to you to do what you can within your capacity to speak truth to tyranny, to speak truth to power. Remember the word within your capacity. So there are wise things to do, and there are things that are more harm to you than good. Choose what is wise. Don't be a coward, but don't be reckless, okay? And don't give up on yourself. It sometimes feels like we are speaking into a void, that no one is listening, that what we do doesn't matter. But that is the furthest thing from the truth. And I'm reminded of something so beautiful in the Sirah, where in the Battle of Badr, so for anyone who's not familiar, this is a battle where the Muslims were outnumbered 3-1. And they were fighting for their very existence. And so the Quraysh, who were attacking, were on this other side of the valley. And the command to the Prophet ﷺ was to throw, and if you read the tafsir, this is what it says, to actually throw sand across the valley to the enemy. Sand. Do you know how far sand goes? It barely goes it's hardly 2 inches, and it doesn't do anything to an entire army in full armor on the other side of a valley. But that was the command, throw sand. And then Allah took that sand and blinded and put it in the eyes of the enemy, and eventually it led to their defeat. Now, what do we learn from this? We learn that it is our job to throw sand in the eyes of injustice. Throw your sand even if it looks like it doesn't work, even if it looks like it's ineffective. Do what we are told to do, which is keep speaking the truth, even when it feels like no one's listening.
Thank you so much for, again, those very wise words and bringing that to light here tonight. So I'll leave you with one last question before we let you go. About an hour south of here, we have a university, and I'm bringing this up because I know we have a lot of student leaders in the room with us tonight. They're always wonderful volunteers of Iman, and we even have an Iman student chapter at the university about 5 minutes from here. But an hour south is IU Bloomington, and it was recently named one of the worst colleges in the country for freedom of speech. And they're now asking professors to submit their syllabus on the internet so anybody can comment. and make it public online, and so anyone can file a complaint. And I know we just have so many of these passionate students in the audience tonight, and many of them are activists and leaders and advocates in their own communities. So what do you say specifically to the students in the room who are very passionate and right now are just feeling a lot of attacks on their free speech and on their advocacy on their campuses?
To all the students who are fighting the good fight, who are speaking out, you are the heroes of our moment. We are going through a dark and difficult moment in our history as a country. And you are the heroes of that moment. And it goes back to what I said. Be brave, but don't be reckless. Speak your truth, but weigh your words. There's a reason why we are called the Middle Nation, because we are not extreme in any one way. We don't speak in a way that is going to get us, in trouble for the most part on purpose. We are not there to provocate. But at the same time, that doesn't mean we don't speak what is true in a measured and firm way. So it's hard to tell you exactly what to do because the policies of your school are the way they are, and it would take a lawyer to tell you exactly how to navigate. But my overall advice is don't allow these things to silence you completely. And at the same time, weigh the consequences. Weigh the pros and cons. Be wise. Seek guidance from elders and God. And I want to end by sharing one story to demonstrate that I do understand what you might be going through. So Senator Fadi mentioned that he was an intern with me when I was appointed to the President Obama's Advisory Council on Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. That appointment, a lot of the times these appointments no one even hears about. They're just very kind of below the radar, and that's what I expected for myself. But somehow, it started with the Arab media, which is a great place for stories to become extremely exaggerated. So the Arab media found my name on this list that was released, from the White House. And a reporter found my number and did an interview with me. It was for Al Arabiya newspaper. Again, not a big thing. And I explained to him what I did was very accurate, did not exaggerate my influence at all. But despite all of that, he still wanted a really nice headline. So he wrote, Obama's Muslim advisor. He was like, oh boy. And I mentioned I was Egyptian. And so then the Egyptian media got wind of it. And they went just to town, I was suddenly the most famous person in Egypt. What that did though, what all this sort of excitement in the Arab world and then even more broadly the Muslim world did, is it got the attention of the American Islamophobia industry. And they went to work to attack me. They went to work to discredit me, to disenfranchise me, to silence me, to get me fired from not only the appointment, but from my job at Gallup, because the appointment was not a job, it was an honorary position. I still had my day job. And so they started fabricating stories about me that had no basis whatsoever. Because remember, I was just a nerdy researcher at Gallup with no public profile, no social media. They had nothing to dig up. There was nothing about me. I was a completely private person. So there's not like a tweet that I did from 10 years ago. I'm so old that I didn't have Twitter when I was crazy, so they couldn't find anything, right? I didn't have like this record that they could dig up. So they waited and waited until I finally made a mistake. So what was my mistake? My mistake was I took an interview from a channel in the UK called the Islam Channel. May Allah forgive them. And it was on a show called Muslima Dilemma. Sounded very harmless, right? Muslima Dilemma. But not without my knowledge, there was someone else being interviewed with me. Like I was sharing a stage with this other person who was in the studio and I was on the phone. I couldn't even see who was there. I was just blindly on the phone talking, and they just happened to mention 1 second before we were going on air, by the way, you're going to be joined by the head of the women's wing of Hizb ut-Tahrir. Okay, so this is a group, you can look it up. Controversial organization that I would never have agreed to share a stage with in a million years. It would have just been trouble. But here I was. So she's saying some pretty controversial things, and I am, because I'm at Gallup as a researcher, I'm not allowed to engage in debate with people. My existence is, here's what the data says, period. So I'm not objecting, or it's not because I'm endorsing what she's saying, I'm just not allowed to debate, and that's not what I'm there to do. Then we get a question from the audience, and it was the following. You're saying that according to your research, Muslims around the world have favorable opinions of Sharia, which they do. Why do you think that it's so negatively perceived in America? And my answer is, well, I think that generally people don't know a lot about Islam, and I think that Sharia is misunderstood. Headline, the very next morning, in a major UK publication, Obama advisor, Sharia is misunderstood. So implying, right, that I was advocating for Sharia, or that he was advocating for Sharia, by extension. And it became a 6 months full throttle harassment campaign. I was getting death threats, I was getting rape threats, people were writing in, major important people writing in to get me fired from my job. It was even something the White House was concerned about because Obama was, mentioned. It was a nightmare. And it finally ended, it's a very long story, but it finally ended with an article that kind of set the record straight. Why I tell you this story is this. If this much effort and this much energy and this many resources went into silencing me, disenfranchising me, making sure I was radioactive to any policymaker, why would we ever silence ourselves just because we're apathetic? Why would we do their work for them by disengaging, not being involved, and withdrawing? Why would we take our own power away? If those who want to silence us are this adamant in silencing us, why would we ever do their work for them? Don't make it easy for them. And after this horrible experience, I just kept on keeping on. I kept on doing what I was doing. I never quit. This was in 2009. And here we are.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your bravery. Thank you for your trailblazing, as Senator Kadora mentioned earlier. Thank you so much for laying the groundwork so that so many of us can follow in your shoes and take on these positions and go out into the world and make our voices known here. And that's what we hope that all of you were able to take away, maybe a little bit of advice tonight, a little bit of encouragement. Thank you all so much. Thank you. Can we give another round of applause to Ms. Mogahed? If you are a cohort member, I know you all have to be up so bright and early tomorrow morning. So we'll let you guys get out of here soon, but if you are a cohort member, could you please make your way over to the left side of the stage here so we can grab a picture? And please, we have dessert in the back. Please grab some. I don't want to take it home. I don't need all of that. And also, if you'd like to stay up to date with Iman, please follow us on Facebook, on social media, sign up for our newsletters so that you can keep getting our updates.